friends, welcome to a new episode in the Women in Ministry series here on Rooted. Today I'm going to be talking about 1 Timothy 2:12 and all of the confusion that comes along with it. Now if you'll notice over here, I have a Trader Joe's peanut butter cup. If I can successfully get through this video in 10 minutes, for your sake and mine, I can eat it. I'm pretty excited. If not, I'm giving it to my cat to play with. Before we get started, I want to give you a quick review of what we've gone over so far. In our overview of complementarianism and egalitarianism, we said that complementarians generally believe that roles between men and women are distinct, they're different, but they're complementary. They go hand in hand. Roles between women and men for egalitarians are pretty much equal. There's very little distinction, and they have the same authority and responsibilities in the world, in the church, in the family. So today we're going to dive into 1 Timothy 2:12. I'm going to give you a little preview of where we're going, and then we will get right into the issues. As a reminder, this series is not to tell you what to think, it's to show you how to think. So in this video, I'm going to be giving you some context and background on 1 Timothy, and then we're going to be diving straight into what complementarians believe about this verse and what egalitarians believe about this verse. Now, I'm also going to be doing some critiques of the views and then also responses that people holding these views might give. This will help you make an educated decision on which view you hold. Let's get into the context of this book first. It's so important. The Apostle Paul wrote this letter to Timothy, his young mentee, in the year 62. Now, 62 AD is after both Ephesians and Galatians were written. Now remember, Ephesians and Galatians were books that were used to support the complementarian and egalitarian views, respectively. Now that we have a little bit of the historical context, let's look at the biblical context. Before we dive into chapter 2, we have to look at chapter 1. Turn to 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. We have a biblical context here as well as some historical context. Timothy is facing false teaching of strange doctrines in Ephesus. If we look at chapter 2 and 3, we can see that Paul is talking about the church. Paul is not talking about everyday life. He's telling Timothy how to run the church and how the order should be. Now, because I've encouraged y'all to read in paragraphs and not simple verses, that's what I'm going to do. I'm reading out of the NASB Bible today, and I'm going to read 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. Okay, I want to say a couple of things about verse 11 and then verse 15 before we move on to verses 12 through 14. First of all, in verse 11, Paul is being a pretty forward-thinking guy here. In old Jewish culture, women were not permitted to learn alongside men. So he's saying women should be learning with men. Verse 15 is a little bit tricky, and that's why in my next video, I'm going to be addressing verse 15 and all of the different things it could mean. Let's get started with verses 12 through 14. I'm going to be starting with a complementarian view, as I did in my last video. I'll give some critiques that the egalitarians would have of that view, and then some responses. Complementarians generally believe that 1 Timothy 2:12 should be taken at face value. They see that it says Paul is not permitting a woman to teach in the church or to have authority over a man, and so that's what they say. When you go to most complementarian churches, you won't see women teaching and having authority over men. However, some complementarians make a distinction between what is teaching and what is preaching. So in this case, some women may be found teaching Bible study classes, Sunday school classes, prayer groups, as long as they're not on the front podium preaching. Something else I want to add in right here is that the word used for men here in verse 12 means actual men. It doesn't mean mankind, including women. It means grown, of age, upright men. The word is aner. It's not anthropos, in case you guys are Greek freaks out there. It's aner. This is a man who's most likely married or at least living on his own. We're talking about adult men, not children, not high schoolers. For complementarians, this argument goes back to order in the church, and we can see that as their evidence uses verses 13 and 14. They say, well, Adam was created first, and then Eve, and so it also says Eve shouldn't be teaching because of her transgression, so women will not teach, men will teach instead. probably the biggest critique of this complementarian view is, what about Priscilla? Do y'all remember Priscilla from Acts 18:26? A lot of egalitarians say, how can you prohibit a woman from teaching in the church when clearly we have Priscilla who's talking with Apollos, making sure he understands doctrine. She's definitely teaching Christian doctrine. Complementarian might answer in this way. The verb that is used to describe what Priscilla is doing is ektithemi. It's not didasko, which is the teaching verb in 1 Timothy 2:12. Ektithemi is pretty much translated to explain. So what we have here is complementarians making a very large distinction between teaching and explaining. Also, when you're dealing with this verb ektithemi, complementarians would say there's really no authority infused into that verb like there is in didasko. Let's move into the egalitarian view. Egalitarians, remember, believe that women and men have no distinction between roles in the church. So they see that what's going on here is not necessarily a command for all time. It's most likely cultural, and that it doesn't really mean women can't teach in the church. Most egalitarians would take this word to have authority to mean to usurp or dominate authority. Egalitarians would argue that women at this time were not allowed to dominate authority over men or to take authority away from them. They would use verses 13 and 14 to support this view by saying that Eve was created to be Adam's partner, not his boss. They're also appealing to order, but not hierarchy. Furthermore, given the false teaching climate, egalitarians are concerned that some of the women in the group may have been doing some false teaching. Complementarians will take issue with that in the critiques. So overall, egalitarians believe that women were not allowed to teach in this particular context because of what was going on in the cultural climate. They do not believe that this teaching would hold today. Now, one of the biggest critiques that's going to come from complementarians to the egalitarians is about that verb authentane. They would say authentane doesn't mean to usurp authority or dominate authority. It means to have authority or exercise authority. It doesn't mean usurp or dominate anywhere else in the Bible, and they would be right. The egalitarians would counter with this. It may not mean that in the Bible, but in other historical documents, it does. If you look at 1st century BC poems and letters, you see this verb authentane translated usurping or dominating authority all the time. Furthermore, some early Bible manuscripts, as early as 3rd and 4th century in Latin, are translating this authentane verb to usurp or dominate authority. So that's something to consider. Complementarians also take issue by saying teaching and having authority cannot have separate connotations in this verse. When the egalitarian said that teaching is good, but usurping authority would be a bad connotation, complementarians call a foul. They would say that the conjunction linking these two verbs, ude, also links their connotations. One cannot be good and the other bad. They both have to be good or they both have to be bad. Egalitarians would respond and say, not exactly. Ude can also mean a move from general to specific. They can say teaching is good, but it's the dominating authority that's bad, moving from big to small. The final critique that would come from the complementarians would say, why would Paul be talking about false teaching here? There's two reasons why. First, Paul has a word that he uses for false teaching, and he used it in 1 Timothy 1, 3, and 4, which we already read. He doesn't use it here. Secondly, there are no female false teachers mentioned anywhere in the Bible. So why would he be talking about false teaching? The egalitarians would counter with a cultural argument. The Temple of Artemis had a very big impact on Ephesian culture, which you see other places in the Bible. They would say that women were being impacted by this cult and were then teaching it in the churches. We've gone over a lot of arguments, a lot of critiques. Which one do you think is most convincing? Have you begun to rethink any of your views? Comment down below. Next week, we're going to be talking about 1 Timothy 2:15 and answering the question, if I'm childless, am I going to hell? Spoiler.